The heir, a man named Declan, did not even blink as he stepped forward. His designer shoe caught the edge of Kisara's bucket, and in a sharp, jagged motion, his hand slammed into her shoulder. The porcelain cup he held tilted. The world seemed to slow down as the dark, boiling liquid poured over Kisara's arm. She did not scream. She only made a small, choked sound in her throat as the heat bit into her skin like 1,000 needles. Declan didn't check to see if she was hurt. He only looked at the brown splashes on his expensive sleeve and cursed. "Look at what you've done, you clumsy girl," he snapped, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. He wiped his arm and walked away, leaving Kisara trembling on the floor, her skin turning a bright, angry red. From the far end of the hallway, the heavy double doors creaked open. The sound was low, but it stopped the heartbeat of everyone in the room. Taewon Zyrek stepped into the light. He did not look like a man who belonged in a hospital. He wore a suit as black as a starless night, and his face was a mask of cold, hard stone. Beside him, 2 large German shepherds moved in perfect rhythm with his steps. Their ears were sharp, and their eyes were fixed on the man who had just walked away from the mess. Taewon did not look at Declan. He walked straight to Kisara. To the rest of the world, Taewon was a monster, a king of shadows who ruled the city with an iron fist. But as he reached the girl on the floor, his posture softened. He knelt in the middle of the wet floor, heedless of his expensive clothes. "Kisara," he said. His voice was not a roar, it was a low, steady hum that acted like a shield against the pain. She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll clean it up." Taewon reached out and gently took her hand, avoiding the blistered skin of her forearm. Years ago, when she was just a child lost in the rain, he had found her. He had seen a spark of courage in her that reminded him of his own mother. He had not given her a life of luxury, he had given her something better, a place where she was safe. He was her only family, and she was the only person who knew that beneath the suit, his heart still beat for something other than power. He looked at the burn, then his gaze shifted to the retreating back of the billionaire's son. His eyes grew dark and flat. The dogs let out a low growl that vibrated through the floor tiles. Taewon stood up slowly, his hand resting on the head of his lead dog. He didn't need to speak. The bond between the master of the city and the girl with the mop was silent, deep, and now, it was dangerous. The debt had been recorded, and Taewon Zyrek always collected. Declan Thatcher did not look back. He strode through the grand hall as if the air itself belonged to him. In his mind, he was already in the meeting room, signing the deal that would make him even richer. He was a man who saw the world as a map of things he could buy and people he could use. To him, the woman on the floor was no different than a broken chair or a torn rug. She was an inconvenience that had slowed his pace for 10 seconds, and he hated being slowed down. He reached the end of the hall and stopped. He pulled a silk cloth from his pocket to dab at the small brown spots on his cuff. He let out a loud, heavy sigh, making sure everyone nearby could hear how annoyed he was. "This place is losing its touch," he muttered into his phone, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "They let anyone walk these floors now. I almost ruined my suit because of some clumsy girl who can't hold a tray straight." Behind him, the silence of the room began to change. It was no longer the quiet of a peaceful house, but the heavy, cold silence that comes before a storm. Declan felt a sudden chill on the back of his neck, but he brushed it off. He was a Thatcher, he didn't have to worry about the feelings of the help. He didn't see the way the other staff members pulled back into the shadows, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and shock. They weren't looking at the spilled coffee or the broken cup. They were looking at the man who had been standing in the archway the entire time. Kisara remained on her knees, her breath coming in short, pained gasps. The heat from the coffee was still sinking deep into her skin, but the sting of Declan's words felt even sharper. She watched him walk away, his head held high, his back straight with pride. He had wiped her away as if she were nothing. He didn't realize that in this house, everything had a price. He didn't know that the floor he was walking on was polished by hands that were now shaking with pain, and that those hands belonged to the only person the master of the house truly cared for. Declan turned a corner, disappearing toward the private offices, still talking loudly about his busy day. He left behind a trail of wet footprints and a woman who was trying her best not to cry. He had made his move, thinking it was a small thing. He had no idea that by stepping over k-Seoul, he had stepped right into a trap that he could never escape. The air in the emergency room was cold and smelled like sharp soap. k-Seoul lay on a hard metal bed, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. The skin on her arm was no longer just red, it was blistering, and every tiny movement felt like a fresh flame touching her body. A nurse had wrapped a white bandage around her head to help with the shock, but the real pain was in her arm, tucked close to her chest. She looked around the busy room, hoping for a kind face, but everyone seemed too busy to see her. At the end of the hall, Dr. Urin Seaver walked with a brisk, confident stride. His white coat was perfectly ironed, and he didn't have a single hair out of place. He was the best surgeon in the city, the kind of man who only worked on the most important cases. As he passed k-Seoul's bed, his eyes flicked toward her for a split second. He saw the stained blue uniform and the messy bandage. To him, she was just another worker who had been careless. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. "Doctor, please," the nurse whispered, pointing toward k-Seoul. "She has severe burns. She needs your help right now." Dr. Seaver didn't even look back. He was focused on a man in a very expensive suit standing near the exit. It was Gregory Thatcher, Declan's father, who had come to the hospital to complain about a tiny scratch on his finger. "Mr. Thatcher," Dr. Seaver said, his voice suddenly warm and full of fake cheer. "I heard you had a little accident. Let's get you into a private room right away. We can't have you waiting out here with everyone else." k-Seoul let out a small, pained cry as the nurse tried to clean her wound, but the doctor didn't flinch. He stayed focused on the billionaire, laughing at a small joke the man made. He was busy making sure the rich donor felt like a king, while k-Seoul sat only a few feet away, her body shaking from the heat of the burn. The doctor acted as if she were a piece of furniture, a silent object that didn't feel pain or sadness. The elite surgeon led Mr. Thatcher away, his back turned to the girl who actually needed him. He thought he was being smart by following the money. He had no idea that while he was flattering the billionaire, a dark car had just pulled into the hospital parking lot. He didn't know that the invisible woman he was ignoring was the only family of a man who could end his career with a single phone call. The hospital was a storm of noise. Machines beeped, phones rang, and nurses hurried past with heavy carts. But then, the large glass front doors slid open, and a new kind of sound entered the room. It was the rhythmic, steady click-clack of claws on the hard floor. It was a sound that didn't belong in a place of medicine, and it was enough to make the busiest person stop and turn around. Taewon Zyrek walked through the entrance. He did not rush, yet he moved with a power that seemed to push the air out of the room. He wore his dark suit, looking sharp and dangerous against the bright, white hospital walls. Beside him, the two German shepherds walked in perfect sync. They did not bark. They did not growl. They simply watched everyone with eyes that were too smart and too calm. Their presence was like a heavy weight that settled over the hallway. As Taewon moved deeper into the ER, the chaos began to die down. The nurses stopped talking. The machines seemed to beat more quietly. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. He didn't look at the reception desk to check in. He didn't ask for directions. He followed a path only he knew, his eyes fixed on the area where the most vulnerable patients lay. He reached the spot where k-Seoul had been sitting. He saw the empty bed and the small, stained cloth she had left behind. His jaw tightened, a small movement that showed a mountain of hidden anger. The dogs stood like statues at his side, their ears pointed up, listening to the heartbeat of the building. The elite Dr. Seaver, who was still laughing at a story Gregory Thatcher was telling, suddenly felt the change in the air. The hallway had grown tomb-like. The doctor turned around, his smile fading as he saw the man in the black suit and the large, attentive dogs. He had spent his whole life around powerful people, but he had never seen power like this. This was not the power of money. It was the power of someone who owned the shadows. Taewon stopped 10 feet away from the doctor. The silence was so thick it felt like it could break. He looked at the doctor, then at the billionaire, and finally at the empty space where k-Seoul should have been receiving care. The air grew cold, and for the first time that day, Dr. Seaver felt a shiver of true fear. He realized too late that the storm had finally arrived. The silence in the hallway was so heavy it felt like it might crush the lungs of anyone who dared to speak. Taewon stood as still as a statue, his dark eyes locked onto Dr. Seaver. The doctor felt a bead of sweat roll down his forehead. He tried to open his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat when the lead German shepherd let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the floor. Taewon reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, silver watch. He didn't look angry. He looked like a judge about to pass a sentence. He clicked the side of the watch, and the tiny ticking sound seemed to echo like a drumbeat in the quiet room. "You have 60 seconds, Taewon said. His voice was a cold whisper that made the doctor's skin crawl. "In those 60 seconds, you will find the girl you ignored. You will use every bit of your skill to treat her burn. If you do not, your career will end before the sun goes down. Your hospital will be closed, and your name will be erased from every record in this city." Dr. Seaver's eyes darted to Gregory Thatcher, looking for help. But the billionaire was backing away, his face pale and his hands shaking. He recognized Taewon now. He knew that the man in front of them was someone who could make people vanish with a flick of his wrist. The doctor looked back at the watch. The tiny hand was moving. 5 seconds were already gone. 10. The pressure in the room was rising. Dr. Seaver realized that his expensive suits, his fancy title, and his wealthy friends meant nothing here. He was just a man who had made a terrible mistake. "Where is she?" the doctor shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. He turned to a nurse, his face twisted in fear. "Where is the woman in the blue uniform? Get the burn kit. Get the best medicine we have. Move." He didn't wait for an answer. He began to run toward the back of the ER, his white coat flapping behind him. He didn't care about the billionaire's finger anymore. He didn't care about his pride. He was racing against a clock that was held by a king of shadows. Taewon remained where he was, watching the doctor disappear around the corner. He did not blink. He simply stood with his dogs, a silent and terrifying force of justice. He was not just waiting for a doctor to do his job. He was waiting to see if the world was ready to learn that no one was truly invisible. While the hospital staff scrambled in a panic, Taewon remained a statue of calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted phone. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to show anger. He simply sent a short, coded message to a group of people the world never saw, his hounds. These were not animals, but the smartest hackers and most ruthless lawyers in the city. They were the invisible army that lived in the wires and the law books, waiting for his command to strike. In a quiet office across town, the screens began to glow. With a few clicks, the paper war began. The Thatcher family believed their money was safe behind high walls and secret codes, but to Taewon's team, those walls were made of sand. They started at the edges, freezing the family's credit cards. At a high-end restaurant, Declan's father's card was declined in front of his richest friends. It was the first crack in their perfect world. Then, the hounds dug deeper. They found the hidden files and the secret bank accounts. One by one, the numbers on the screens began to drop toward zero. Huge sums of money that had taken a lifetime to build started to vanish into thin air. Contracts for the Thatcher Tower were cancelled. Loans were called in by banks that were suddenly terrified to be linked to the family name. Every penny the Thatchers owned was being sucked away as if by a giant vacuum. Inside the hospital, Gregory Thatcher felt his phone buzz over and over. He pulled it out, his face turning from pale to a ghostly white. He watched his bank balance disappear in real time. He saw the emails from his partners, telling him he was finished. He looked at Taewon, who was still standing with his dogs, and realized that his entire empire was being burned to the ground without a single match being lit. Taewon looked at his watch again. The paper war was winning. He wasn't just taking their money, he was taking their power, their pride, and their future. He was showing them that when you hurt the people he protected, he would make sure you had nothing left to hide behind. The Thatchers had treated k-Seoul like she was nothing, and now, Taewon was making sure the world treated them the same way. Dr. Seaver stood in the middle of the sterile hallway, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He looked over at Gregory Thatcher, the man he had spent the last hour trying to impress. The billionaire was staring at his phone with a face full of horror. He wasn't looking at the doctor anymore. In fact, he wasn't looking at anyone. Mr. Thatcher, the doctor whispered, his voice trembling. I need your help. I did what you asked. I prioritized you. Tell this man to stop. Gregory Thatcher didn't even look up. He took a shaky step back, his eyes darting toward the exit. He was a man who had always bought his way out of trouble, but he could see that money was no longer a shield. Without saying a word, the billionaire turned his back on the doctor and hurried away, disappearing through the sliding doors like a coward. The donors and the wealthy friends who had promised the doctor a bright future were gone. He was standing all alone in the cold light of the ER. Taewon stepped forward, the sound of his shoes like a steady heartbeat on the floor. He didn't use a weapon. Instead, he pulled a thin, black tablet from his jacket and held it up so the doctor could see the screen. You followed the money, doctor, Taewon said, his voice flat and empty. But you forgot to cover your tracks. On the screen, a list of names and dates began to scroll. These were the files Dr. Seaver had tried so hard to hide. There were records of surgeries that went wrong, patients who were ignored because they couldn't pay enough, and reports of medical mistakes that had been buried under piles of legal papers. It was the doctor's true history, a history of greed and lies. Dr. Seaver felt the room spin. He realized that Taewon hadn't just watched him today. He had looked into his soul and found every dark secret he owned. The doctor's hands began to shake so hard he had to tuck them into his pockets. He had traded his honesty for a fancy office and rich friends, and now both were gone. The medical board is receiving these files right now, Taewon continued, his dark eyes never leaving the doctor's face. By the time you finish treating k-Seoul, you will no longer be a doctor. You will just be a man who has to answer for everything he has done. The dogs watched the doctor with a steady, judgmental gaze. Dr. Seaver looked at the tablet, then at the empty hallway where his rich friends used to be. He finally understood that a debt was a debt, whether it was paid in money or in truth. He turned back toward the trauma room, his head bowed, ready to do the only thing he had left, save the woman he had treated like nothing. The air in the trauma room was still and heavy. k-Seoul lay on the gurney, her arm now properly bandaged and her breathing steady, though her face was still pale from the ordeal. The bright surgical lights above her didn't seem so frightening anymore, not with Taewon standing at the foot of her bed like a tall, dark wall of protection. The heavy doors swished open, and two of Taewon's men walked in. They were holding Declan Thatcher by the arms. The young billionaire no longer looked like the proud, loud man from the hotel lobby. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and his face was wet with tears of pure terror. He looked like a small boy who had wandered into a lion's den. Please, Declan begged, his voice shaking so hard he could barely speak. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know who she was. Taewon didn't move. He didn't even look at Declan at first. He just reached down and gently adjusted the blanket over k-Seoul's feet. The German shepherds sat perfectly still, their golden eyes fixed on Declan, waiting for a single command to move. "That is your mistake," Taewon said, his voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of ice. "You thought you only had to be kind to people who were famous or rich. You thought a woman in a uniform was invisible. You thought she had no one to stand behind her." Taewon's men pushed Declan forward until he was inches away from the gurney. Declan looked down at k-Seoul. He saw the bandages, the stains on her blue uniform, and the tired look in her eyes. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a janitor. He was looking at a human being whose life he had almost ruined for no reason at all. "Apologize," Taewon commanded. It wasn't a request. The room felt like it was shrinking. Declan's knees hit the hard floor. He realized that the woman he had treated like trash was actually the most protected person in the entire city. He realized that his father's money couldn't save him from the silent man and the two dogs watching his every breath. "I am so sorry," Declan sobbed, his head bowed low. "I am so sorry, k-Seoul." k-Seoul looked at him. She didn't feel happy to see him crying, but she felt a strange, new weight in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. She looked at Taewon, and the Mafia Boss gave her a tiny, almost invisible nod. The power in the room didn't come from the billionaire on his knees, it came from the quiet bond between a king and a girl who was no longer a ghost. The weeks that followed were quiet and peaceful. k-Seoul stayed in a bright, private room at the top of the hospital, where the windows looked out over the entire city. Her arm was healing well, leaving only a faint mark that reminded her of the day everything changed. She spent her time reading books about medicine and nursing, no longer having to worry about how she would pay for her next meal or her brother's school books. On the day she was ready to leave, Taewon came to her room. He wasn't carrying a briefcase or a phone. Instead, he held a small, silver lighter. On the table sat a neat pile of dark blue cloth, the stained janitor uniform k-Seoul had been wearing during the accident. It was a symbol of the years she had spent being invisible, a ghost in the corners of grand rooms. Taewon picked up the uniform and led her out to the wide balcony. Without a word, he flicked the lighter. A small, orange flame danced in the breeze before he touched it to the fabric. They stood together in silence, watching as the dark blue cloth turned to gray ash and floated away into the sky. The weight of her old life was gone, carried off by the wind. "You will never have to hide again," Taewon said, his voice soft but firm. That evening, the city's evening news did not talk about the Thatcher's bankruptcy or the surgeon who lost his license. Instead, they spoke about a new announcement from the Zyrek estate. A formal notice had been sent out to every major office and family in the city. It stated that k-Seoul Vane was no longer an employee of the household. She was now a legally recognized member of the Zyrek family. In the eyes of the city, she was now the sister of the most powerful man in the shadows. People who used to walk past her without a glance now bowed their heads when they saw her car pass by. But to k-Seoul, the most important thing wasn't the power or the money. It was the fact that when she walked through the halls of her new home, the man with the black suit and the two loyal dogs looked at her and saw a person who truly belonged. The ghost was gone, and in her place stood a woman who finally knew her own name.